Hi friends, welcome to a new episode of Beauty History. I am your host, Allison Chase. Beauty History is where we take a deep dive into the history, the life, the legacy of an icon in the fashion or beauty world. Join me the first Friday of every month where we take a deep dive into a new subject. But before we go any further, let's take a second to grab our iced coffee or hot coffee. Let's take a sip and let's get started. For today's episode, we will be taking a deep dive into Elsa Schiaparelli. She was an Italian designer, a surrealist artist, and Coco Chanel's greatest rival. Yes, so let's go ahead and take a deep dive into Elsa Schiaparelli. Now, she was born September 10th, 1890 in Rome. But she wasn't just born in Rome. She was born at the Palazzo Corsini. This is a palace, not just a grand house. It's literally a palace in Rome. She was born into aristocracy. This is a late Baroque style palace that was built around the 1730s. Her mother was a Neapolitan aristocrat who was a descendant of the Medici family in Italy. Her father was a scholar. He was a noted authority on the Sanskrit language. He was a collector of medieval manuscripts and art, and he was also the dean of the University of Rome, which is where Elsa would later go on to study philosophy later in life. So Elsa was just born into tremendous wealth. Like, she was just born into a very wealthy family, an aristocratic family, very well placed in life. Elsa had an uncle who was an astronomer who discovered the Martian canals, and she spent a lot of time around adults and around very well-educated adults, and her uncle helped foster this interest in astronomy and stars and zodiacs, and this would lend later in life where she would use a lot of these symbols in her work as a designer. She had another uncle who was an Egyptologist, and he was famed for discovering the tomb of Nefertari, and he would later go on to be the curator of the Egyptian Museum of Turin. So, like I said, just a family of very well-educated people. And what's interesting is Elsa grew up listening not only to traditional fairy tales and stories you tell children, but also reading and studying some of the manuscripts around the palace. You know, her father was interested in different cultures and religions, and so was Elsa. She wasn't just reading, fairy tales about the three little bears as a child. She was reading about ancient civilizations and ancient cultures and ancient religions and ruins, and so her imagination really helped her run wild with some of these stories. And even though she was very, very privileged as a child, like she grew up in extreme wealth and aristocracy, she was still also very lonely as a child. She spent a lot of time just sort of wandering the palace alone because her parents, left her with governesses and nannies and didn't spend that much time with her. So even though she was very privileged, she still was a very lonely child. So one instance of Elsa's imagination getting the better of her is as a teenager, she was still obsessed and reading a lot about ancient countries and cultures, and she was obsessed with the myth of the hunt in Greek culture and Greek literature. And so she put together a book of her own erotic poetry, and she published the book. I don't know how she did this. I don't know how she was she had a lot of money, of course, and her parents weren't always keeping an eye on her. So I'm not exactly certain how a teenager publishes a book, but she published a book called Arethusa. I tried my best to get my hands on a copy of this book. I was not able to, but it was a collection of erotic poems written by a teenage Elsa Schiaparelli. Her parents were horrified. I mean, her parents were very conservative, very like bougie, very stiff aristocrats. So you can imagine they did not appreciate this, especially in like the 1900s. Absolutely not. So her parents, as a reaction, decided to send her off to a convent in Switzerland. It was a convent / boarding school in Switzerland. Needless to say, Elsa was not happy with this. As a form of protest, Elsa went on a hunger strike and that forced her parents to send her back home. So as I stated, Elsa had lots of wealth, lots of privilege, just like a lot of comforts in life that most of us are not born into. But she still felt very controlled and stifled. Like she was a very creative, expressive, artistic person. And in the environment that she was born in, she did not feel the liberty and freedom that she wanted to. And so she always craved this freedom. And she tried to remedy this by taking a job in England and working at a country home to take care of other people's children. This did not work out for her at all. I don't think she was made to be a nanny or a governess by any means. And so that was a bit of a failure. She had to return back home to her parents, which she was not happy about. And something she found out when she returned home to her parents that made her even more unhappy is when she returned home, her parents were discussing her marriage without her. Like her parents were in discussion with someone. He was a Russian wealthy person. I don't know the term exactly. Like I don't know what his position was. He was just like a very wealthy man, probably some noble, some aristocrat from Russia, and her parents were just like, yes, so we've met this man. He's very interested in marrying you. He's very persistent. We think it would be a good match, because something to remember is someone like Elsa, like her status in society, like being an aristocrat and being wealthy, she more than likely would not have been able to choose who she was going to marry, because marriages like that, when it came to someone with that sort of status and that sort of money, it really was a business transaction more than anything else. And her parents would more than likely be the ones to decide who and when she would marry. And Elsa was horrified. I mean, at this point, she was probably a late teenager, early 20s, like 19, 20, 21, that age when you're not really sure what you're doing in life, but being married off to some man you don't know and have no interest in is not really ideal. So she left her parents' home, the palace, again, and she went to London this time just to sort of, get away from the annoying Russian suitor he was very persistent. I think he would have married her right away. I mean, she came from a very wealthy family, so I think she was a bride that was sought after by a lot of people because she had so much money. So she goes to London. And at this point in time, Elsa had an interest in theosophy. Now, this is something that I didn't know anything about. So theosophy is a religion that was established in the US in the late 19th century. And it's categorized as both part of like a new religious movement and also the occult, because Elsa had an interest in a little bit of the occult, like stars, zodiacs, that sort of thing. And so there was a lecture happening one night in London when she was there that was on theosophy. And she also was a little bit interested in like everything it's like psychic phenomena. It's something that, you know, she'd read about in like the vast libraries at the palace, and she heard about this lecture. And so she thought, why not go? And so that night, the lecturer, the person presenting, sort of like me right now, was a man named Willem de Went, and he claimed to have psychic abilities. Now, in reality, this guy was a con man. If you think of like the classic snake oil salesman from like the 19th century, the turn of the century, this is literally, he's a caricature of that. This guy, he presented himself as Willem de Went, but he actually went by several different names and aliases. He claimed to have psychic powers. He claimed to have academic credentials. He claimed to be a doctor. He claimed to be a criminal psychologist. He claimed to be a detective, and he claimed to be a lecturer. Okay. He also would often present himself as the world famous Dr. W. de Curler, who, like, snake oil salesman, charlatan, fake, con man, phony, you name it, that was this man here. So Elsa goes to this lecture one night about theosophy. This guy here, this putz, is giving his lecture claiming to be everything and anything. The next day, like, she goes to the lecture, I don't know, Thursday night. Friday, the two of them are engaged. Yeah. So they married very shortly after, on July of 1914. She was 23, he was 30. So Willem attempted to, you know, provide an income for the two of them, but in reality, they lived off of her wedding dowry and off of the allowance that her parents were still paying her, because surprisingly, he was not much of a provider. Color me surprised. So in 1915, the couple had to leave England because he got deported. Again, color me surprised. He was convicted on fortune telling, which at the time was illegal in London, but he was doing it anyway, of course. And so they bounced between Paris and Cannes and Nice and Monte Carlo. But then eventually in 1916, the couple made the transatlantic voyage from England to America. And so they set up some roots in New York. So they lived in New York. They rented an apartment near Central Park. He set up shop. He called it his Bureau of Psychology and also paranormal work, of course. What's interesting is at this time, he actually, well, both of them, Elsa, because of her association with Willem, came under the suspicion of the FBI. However, at the time, it wasn't called the FBI. It was called something. It was called the Federal Government's Bureau of Investigation. This was just what they called the FBI at the time. They were suspicious of him because of his quote-unquote unsettling practices. And also it was suspected maybe that he had pro-German alliances during the First World War, because the First World War is happening in the background of this story here. However, the FBI at the time decided not to deport him again. If you're wondering where this guy was from, great question. I think he was German. He's been deported a few times, so I can't really pinpoint everything. Anyway, ultimately, they were spared any punishment or deportation because, quote unquote, the authorities concluded that he offered no threat to society and that he was just foolish and egocentric. Okay. In 1920, Elsa gave birth to her only daughter, Gogo, and almost immediately after Gogo was born, Willem abandoned his wife and child and never contacted them ever again. Color me surprised. When Gogo was 18 months old, she contracted polio, which was something that used to be very common. Now, thankfully, we have vaccines, so people don't really get that anymore. Gogo was fine. She survived, but she did say that later, as an adult, most of her early childhood, she remembered being in crutches. And this was a hard time for Gogo because she was so little, but also for Elsa because, you know, she had a young daughter. Her marriage was a disaster. She was abandoned. Thankfully for Elsa, she was sort of independently wealthy. Like, she was still relying on her parents, but she had a lot of money, so she wasn't like destitute and homeless by any means, which was very, you know, at least that's a sigh of relief for her. And at the time, she really relied on her friend, Gabby Picabia. They had met on the voyage from England to America on that ship because, you know, back then you couldn't just take a flight across the Atlantic, you had to take a boat. And they had met on that boat and had become really great friends. So Gabby was married to surrealist artist Francis Picabia, and the two of them just became really good friends, and she really relied on Gabby during this hard time. So through Gabby, Elsa was introduced into this rich circle of artists at the time because Gabby's husband, Francis, was a surrealist artist. And so she got to immerse herself in the Dada and surrealist movements at the time and just walk around that inner circle and go to different events and different parties and just hang out with these artists. And she was able to meet people like Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp. And she, like, this was her introduction to the artist world because she herself was a very artistic, creative, imaginative person, but she hadn't really found the proper outlet yet for her artistic endeavors. And later we're going to talk about a very famous surrealist artist, Salvador Dali. Now, currently, there are many people who think that Elsa Schiaparelli herself was one of the great surrealist artists of her time. And her medium, instead of being paint and canvas, was a needle and thread. Like, a lot of people consider her to be one of the great surrealist artists of the time, but fashion was her medium instead of canvas. So I think we should do a brief rundown or description of Dada versus Surrealism. These are two art movements that I find confusing because there is a bit of overlap. So the first movement, Dada, came first, and this emerged during or shortly after, no, I would say during the First World War in Europe. And it was a direct response to the First World War. So Dada or Dadaism is sort of a rejection of logic because for a lot of people, they thought that logic and reason had led to the First World War. So therefore, Dada art should reject logic and reason. You know, like, let's just be absurd, let's be childish, let's be just senseless in a way, and reject war and violence and anything that's supposed to be structured and normal, because clearly normal has led to the worst. So why not? Like, just do something absurd, do something backward. Why not? You know, that was the approach. And I think for me, the best example of Dadaism, Dada art, is from Marcel Duchamp. So he found a urinal and he wrote R. Mutt 1917, and he presented it to an art gallery as his piece, as an installation. Why not? I mean, you find a urinal on the street, you scribble something on it, and you present it as art. Why not? Like, the world makes no sense, so therefore your art should make no sense. That was the approach. Surrealism was a little bit different. Surrealism was a bit more of a cultural movement, and it was also started in Europe a bit more towards the end of the First World War, and it sort of spun off of Dadaism. And this was a little bit more of melting reality with the dream world. And it had a lot of artists who had themselves taken part in the First World War, who had seen some very disturbing and unsettling tableaus. And so they sort of tried to replicate that with their art. And oftentimes, surrealism had more to do with political movements like communism and anarchism. So that is a very brief description of Dada versus surreal. Back to Elsa. So technically at this time, she was still married to a husband who could be found nowhere. So she got herself a lover. His name was Mario Laurenti. He was an opera singer. However, their affair was very shortly lived because he passed away suddenly at a young age. However, in 1924, she was able to officially get a divorce. She officially pinned him down and gave him divorce papers. So in 1924, she was a divorced woman, free from this man. And later in 1928, her ex-husband was found murdered under circumstances that were never revealed. Oh well. So after the death of her lover, like this had been a few years that were a bit rough for Elsa. Failed marriage, husband ran away, a daughter who was sick, her lover passed away. Like, not the best time in Elsa's life. So she was relying on her friend Gabby a lot. And Gabby said, listen, my husband and I are moving back to France. We're going back to Paris. Why don't you come with us? And so Elsa said, why not? You know, like, what do I have here in New York? Let's go to Paris. Let's go ahead and move there. And so Elsa moved her and Gogo to Paris, and she got them the nicest apartment in the chicest part of town with maids and nannies and servants and everything, because Elsa was a very wealthy woman. So not only did she have a lot of money, she was wealthy, but people knew she was an aristocrat, so she had status. And now she had this inner circle of artistic friends because of Gabby and her husband and different surrealist artists that she was hanging out with. So her arrival in Paris was fabulous. Like, it wasn't just that she moved to Paris, but she moved to Paris and made the city her own. And she was welcomed with open arms because of all of her connections and her interests and her friends. It was just a huge success for her. When she moved to Paris, this is when her entry into the fashion world began. And this is when she met her lifelong rival, Coco Chanel. More on that in a minute. So at this point, Elsa decided, listen, I have to become independently wealthy. Like, all this money from my parents is nice, but I need to make my own money. So at some point, she started working for Man Ray and assisting him with his Dada magazine called Société Anonyme, but that didn't last very long. So she decided to sort of dip more into the fashion world. Now, when it comes to fashion and Elsa, she had absolutely no training in designing, in sewing, in anything. She really relied heavily on intuition, on inspiration, on just like whatever inspired her in the moment. And so her methods were unconventional. You know, instead of sketching something and using like a model, she would often just take fabric and measure it on herself. You know, like look in the mirror and cut and sew and use herself, her body, as a model, which was unconventional. But I think we can say that Elsa herself was unconventional, and at this time her friends in Paris nicknamed her Schiap, short for Schiaparelli. And it's in the 1920s, like around 26, 27, that Elsa decided to start doing knitwear, so sweaters. And one thing that she did very well that became like her namesake, her signature, was something called trompe-l'œil. This is an optical illusion. And this is part of the surrealism of like melting dream fantasy with reality. So she came out with this like sweater knitwear collection that instead of having a bow on top of the sweater, she just had it look like there was a bow on the sweater. And she had a very important meeting to go to at a department store, and she knew that a lot of people would be there who were directors and buyers and, important people. So she decided to show up late, and she came in wearing one of her sweaters that she made for herself with the trempe-l'œil design of the bow. And everyone was like, "What are you wearing? It looks fabulous." And she's like, "Ah, this old thing, I made it. Do you want to buy 500 of them?" And so that's how she started her fashion career, is with knitwear, and specifically with the trempe-l'œil or optical illusion clothing. This was very commercially successful, like her career in fashion. I know that most people don't know Schiaparelli as a household name now. It's more niche, it's more couture, but at the time, she was extremely successful, like very commercially successful, and her works were shown in Vogue magazine, and her trempe-l'œil or optical illusion was really her signature. It wasn't just for the sweater with the bow, it also, evening gloves would have a manicure on them to make it look like red nail polish. So very fanciful, very surrealist, melting reality with dream. Elsa was one of the first designers to create the wrap dress. I know that a lot of us think of wrap dress, we think of Diane von Furstenberg because she took that design and ran with it. But Elsa was one of the first to pioneer this. She was inspired by beachwear, something very easy to take on and off, and also an apron, because an apron ties at the waist, and you can tie it as loose or as tight depending on your size, and it's always very fitted and it always looks flattering. And so that's where she came up with the wrap dress. Now, in 1931, Elsa Schiaparelli was in the center of a heated controversy. It involved women's tennis and a Spanish tennis star, Lily de Alvarez. Now, what did Schiaparelli do that was so controversial? Women's shorts, yes. They didn't call them shorts, they called them a divided skirt, because tennis players need mobility to, play the game. And Lily de Alvarez wore this divided skirt to Wimbledon, and people collectively lost their minds. I guess it was 1931. It must have been very shocking to see a woman wearing a divided skirt. Oh my goodness. Isn't it remarkable that to this day, people still have a lot of opinions about what women wear, and especially about what women wear as professional tennis players. Anyway, the divided skirt, a precursor to shorts, highly, highly controversial. One of Elsa's designs that I am personally very grateful for is a swimsuit with an integrated bra. That was Elsa Schiaparelli. Thank you very much. And at some point, Elsa had a little black dress called the Speakeasy dress that was very popular, especially in the United States during Prohibition, because this little black dress had a secret pocket on the inside lining of the dress that was just the right size to hold a flask. Elsa Schiaparelli is also noted as one of the first designers to use zippers as a main part of the dress. So oftentimes zippers, fasteners, buttons are sort of discreet and are there as a necessity, but Elsa liked to use them front and center, and so place the zipper as the centerpiece of the dress. She loved buttons. She loved very large, elaborate buttons for her. The buttons were almost like jewelry in a way. Like, she liked to make them front and center. So like I mentioned, Elsa was very creative, very impulsive. Her designs were really just a sort of surrealist creative outlet. And something she would do is she would use unconventional materials. So instead of just like silk and cotton, she would use glass to make a cape. She would use acrylic and plastic. You know, if bubble wrap were invented at the time, I'm certain she would have used it for a gown. And one instance, one of her clients, Diana Vreeland, had a gown made out of like acrylic and plastic and some other sort of like unexpected materials. And so Diana took her gown to the dry cleaners, and when she returned to the dry cleaners to pick up her acrylic gown, the dry cleaner just presented her a melted ball of plastic and was like, "I'm so sorry." Apparently the gown just sort of disintegrated upon contact with the cleaning fluids. Now, we have to talk about Coco. So, at the time, both women were very successful. Like, they each had their own niche. They had their own niche, but they had a lot of the same clients. They were both in Paris. They were both part of high society. And, you know, on paper, sometimes it looks like these two women could have had a lot in common and could have been great friends, but they were like mortal enemies. They came from very different backgrounds. I mean, Coco was born destitute. Essentially, her mother died at a young age. Her father abandoned her at a convent. She did not have an easy time in life, whereas Elsa was born super rich, super privileged, had like so much accessible to her. She grew up very well educated as well. So there were some differences there, but in the sad way, both of them felt very lonely and isolated as children, and they had a lot in common as women. You know, I think both of them would have considered themselves feminists before the word feminist was even a thing. They were both designers. They had the same industry. They had a lot of the same friends, a lot of the same clients, but they just were always at each other's throats. They just didn't like each other, which I think is unfortunate. Elsa had had a terrible marriage and she vowed never to marry again, which she did not. Coco had never married and she made a point to never marry. The only man I think she would have married was Arthur Capel, who chose not to marry her because he was new money. He made his own money. He didn't come from like aristocracy or wealth. And so he wanted to marry someone part of aristocracy to level himself up. And so he chose not to marry Coco, which is sad, but they remained lovers. Like, she was his mistress after they got married, and then he died tragically. And so after that, she never really recovered. She had some lovers afterwards, but she never had like her great love. You know, like Arthur was her great love. And then after that, she was like, ugh, over that. And so they did have some similarities, but they just were really not friends. They were both very competitive, and their animosity towards each other just really fueled Parisian high society gossip, because they were part of high society, they were part of cafe culture and the artist scene, and so they really just fueled a lot of the gossip of the day. Elsa worked a lot with different artists, specifically Salvador Dali, which we will talk about soon. But Coco herself also worked with different artists, and she was mad. I think she felt like her territory was being encroached on by Elsa. Like, everything she was doing, Elsa was also doing, and I think she just felt like her world was being impeded on. While we do talk about Elsa being a great surrealist artist and coming out with, you know, ball gowns made out of acrylic and glass capes, etc., she also was very commercially successful. Like, department stores sold her products, and she had lived, you know, she grew up in Europe, but she had spent a lot of time in New York, and so she was attuned to the sensibilities, the tastes of women in New York and also in England and all of Europe. So she was able to be very commercially successful and really just lend her aesthetic across the world. She was extremely successful in the 1930s and 40s because the Schiaparelli aesthetic was broad shoulders and then a very long skirt. And if you look at like 1930s, 1940s aesthetic, that is very Schiaparelli. Like, she really was part of fashion, not only high fashion and couture, but also ready-to-wear department store style, was eating up Schiaparelli. So let's talk about Salvador Dali. Elsa Schiaparelli was great friends with him. They got along like, what's the expression? They just got along really well. They were great friends. They had many friends in common, and they collaborated together on many different pieces. Like for some of his artwork, for some of her fashion, they really just had a very collaborative spirit together. And there are a few things, like the most noted ones, I think, are the lobster, the tear, and the skeleton dresses, as well as the shoe hat. So in the 1930s, Dali had been working with lobsters as a medium. And he had created this mixed medium lobster telephone, which is very famous. And so inspired by the lobster telephone, Elsa created the lobster dress, which was worn famously by Wallis Simpson. Now, this infuriated Coco because she counted Wallis Simpson as a great customer, and this really pissed her off. Next up was the tear dress. So this was like a silk gown with what looked like pieces of flesh torn off, revealing this like bright pink magenta blood or flesh underneath. Like imagine if you just had like a piece of flesh peeled off, revealing the muscle. And so that is very surrealist, you know. It looks a little bit grotesque. It looks like fantasy and reality mixed together. And so you can't really tell if it's just a dress or if the dress has like things peeling off of it. Again, it's using the optical illusion that Schiaparelli was a huge fan of. So this was very famous. And then of course, there was the skeleton dress, which was, I think this is my favorite piece of Schiaparelli. It's a black silk crepe with very elaborate embroidered and not beading, but it has this like sort of cushion. And the skeleton cushion sort of follows the natural skeletal frame. And so it kind of looks a little bit morbid, but it's also this perfect blend of fantasy surrealist and elegance at the same time. And this shape here with the shoulders and the long skirt, that is a very Schiaparelli silhouette. I still think that this looks modern to this day. I would love to see someone wear it on the red carpet. It looks fun, it looks elegant, but it has that surrealist element. And Schiaparelli was one of the first designers, or she's credited as one of the first designers to have themed runways. And this started with the circus collection in 1938. So the theme was the circus. And so models would have evening jackets with little elephants and trapeze artists floating across the cape. In 38 as well, she came out with the Zodiac collection, which was heavily inspired by her uncle, the astronomer. So it had zodiac symbols, stars, solar systems, and just inspired by the evening sky. So in 1933, Dali's wife took a photo of him wearing one of her slippers on his head just for fun. And so Elsa was inspired by this to create the women's shoe hat. So it's an upside down shoe on your head as a hat. Why not? Sounds absurd and very surrealist. And something else that Elsa created around this time is this shade of hot fuchsia pink magenta called Shocking Pink. And this was I think it's great. I think it's fun. I think it's extra. I love color. Of course, Coco had a comment to say. She said that it's a color that makes your teeth hurt. Too much for her, I guess. But this was very well received, just very fun. I mean, who doesn't love a shocking pink? And just like any self-respecting designer, Elsa Schiaparelli came out with fragrances, of course. You have to, it's a rite of passage apparently. And she had many different perfumes. One of them, I think the most popular one was called a Shocking. And the bottle itself was in the shape of Mae West's bust. It was modeled after her bust and her frame. And all of Schiaparelli's perfumes, the bottles were statement pieces. They all were very elaborate and ornate. Of course they would be. And later, Elsa Schiaparelli would go on to design clothing for Hollywood, for film, and she dressed women like Mae West, like Zsa Zsa Gabor, and she also just did a lot of designing for film sets and for movies, because it makes sense. If you think of her very artistic, very surrealist creations, those would lend very well to cinema, and those would stand out. Like Shocking Pink would look great on film. And so it was a very healthy collaboration with Schiaparelli and designing for film. Now, in 1931, Coco was actually hired by Hollywood executive Sam Goldwyn to dress some of his actresses. However, this collaboration was a bust. So Coco's very tasteful, sensible aesthetic did not lend itself well to cinema whatsoever. It was actually quite a disaster. So I think this was also another salt, like more salt in the wound for Coco of Elsa Schiaparelli doing something better than her. So allegedly, their rivalry peaked in a fiery way, allegedly. So apparently, according to some people, the two of them were at a party. Like they had same friends, they had the same clients, so they had the same or similar social circles. And allegedly, they were at a party. Coco went up to Elsa and invited her to dance. And allegedly, as they were dancing, Coco took Elsa's skirts and threw them in a fireplace. I wasn't there, but apparently that happened. I don't know. So literally the only thing that would calm down their rivalry was the outbreak of the Second World War. That was the only thing that worked to calm these two down. When the outbreak happened in France, in Paris, Coco took this as an opportunity to just close up shop. She just closed her shop and she moved into the Ritz-Carlton. And Elsa saw this and was like, listen, me and my daughter, we're getting out of here. She moved her and Gogo back to New York where it was safer. You know, it makes sense. Now, Elsa did not close up the Schiaparelli boutique because she still had employees there. And so Schiaparelli continued during the Second World War, but it was her assistants who were creating the designs. Now, what's interesting is Elsa was able to maintain herself, her lifestyle, her comfort through the sales of her perfume and also the residual sales from her commercial success from the knitwear collection. And what's very interesting is at the time, some people were very suspicious of Elsa. They thought that it was suspicious that she moved back to New York. They thought, does she have collaboration tendencies? What's going on here? I think that's very ironic because as it would turn out later in life, we would find out that Coco was the one who was suspicious. If you have not watched my beauty history episode on Coco Chanel, I highly encourage you to do so. You will find out some very shocking things. You know, I think it's ironic that people were suspicious of Elsa when there was absolutely no need to be. She was innocent. When Coco was the one, you know, some people to this day still rumor that Coco collaborated with Nazis. That rumor is false because Coco herself was a Nazi, allegedly. Don't come for me. So when the war ended, when things were safe for her and Gogo, Elsa Schiaparelli moved her and her daughter back to Paris. And the Paris that she returned to was not the Paris that she had left. You know, when she moved to Paris initially, she was welcomed with open arms and all the social circles, and she was very successful and just fabulous. And when she had left Paris, she was at her absolute peak in life. And so she kind of expected that same welcome. But, you know, people in Paris had been starving for years and they'd wondered where she'd been. And she realized that if she wanted to continue her career, she would literally have to start back at zero. And that was, you know, it was pretty startling for her. It was just very unexpected and not what she thought was going to happen. And she realized that fashion and taste and culture had changed so much in a few short years. I mean, a lot had happened to people in a few short years. It was very condensed and traumatic. And so people were different, and people didn't want this like weird surrealist, like broad shoulder, long skirt aesthetic. They wanted the new look. This is where Mr. Christian Dior comes in, and I have done an episode on Christian Dior and the new look, and I highly recommend you watch that one as well. The new look was an inspiration, a callback to better times. People were tired, women were tired of wearing long skirts and more drab matronly colors. Women were tired of like dark colors and looking like factory workers. Women were tired of looking like blah. They wanted to look feminine and voluptuous, and they wanted to eat and look like they were eating and have curves. And so they wanted the new look. They wanted the full bust, the small waist and full hips. That's what they wanted. And this was not Schiaparelli whatsoever. This was Dior. This was Balenciaga. And so unfortunately, Elsa could not find her place in post-war Parisian fashion. The House of Schiaparelli opened in the 1930s, and unfortunately in 1954 it was shut down. In 57, Elsa created a company just for the perfume licensing, and she was able to live very fabulously, very comfortably off of her residuals and off of her perfume sales. But really, the Second World War is when the nail in the coffin happened for Schiaparelli fashion and haute couture. And, you know, she spent a lot of time with her daughter Gogo afterwards, and traveling and being very fabulous and still very artistic and fun. And she passed away at the age of 83 in 1973. So she lived a very fulfilled life. I think she was able to fulfill her artistic and creative needs. I think she lived a very eccentric life, and I think she lived a very authentic life, which is something we can all strive for. Obviously, today, Coco Chanel is a much more household name than Elsa Schiaparelli. Schiaparelli today is still more niche, more high fashion. However, this is not necessarily due to Miss Coco Chanel herself, not to take away any of the things that she's done, but the reason that Chanel is what it is today is due in large part to German designer Karl Lagerfeld. He revived the brand from death. In the 1980s, he brought the brand back from the dead and made it what it is today. And so if that had happened in the 80s with Schiaparelli, I think the landscape would be very different. But in 2007, an Italian businessman bought Schiaparelli and has been slowly bringing it back to life. Currently, there is a Texas-born designer named Daniel Roseberry, who is the first American to lead a French fashion house. And he has been creative director for Schiaparelli for a few years now. And they are trying to move towards more luxury ready-to-wear. I, for one, hope they bring back more of the trompe-l'œil optical illusion sweater. I would buy that. I think it looks nice, and it's like owning a piece of history. And recently, we have seen more Schiaparelli on the red carpet. You may not know it right away because we're not used to it, but, you know, a lot of fashion is almost like a signature. You can sort of tell what a certain designer is. Recently, there's people like Lady Gaga, Beyonce, Bella Hadid. Bella Hadid in that gown with, it looks like lungs or a tree trunk with roots. That is so Schiaparelli, so surrealist. It's like, it's absurd. It's beyond reality. I love that so much. And Lady Gaga actually wore a Schiaparelli gown to President Joe Biden's inauguration. And fun fact, the top part of her dress was actually bulletproof, and you can see a sort of ornate eagle there, which I guess they didn't have lots of buttons on the dress per se, but you can see that Schiaparelli is very much about a statement piece. And there are some more recent recent Schiaparelli red carpet fashion that screams Schiaparelli. Large buttons, large fasteners, surrealism. That's Schiaparelli tout craché, which basically just means like that's just Schiaparelli. That's what it is right there. So this is today's episode of Beauty History. I hope you learned something. You know, Schiaparelli to me was someone that I've been meaning to talk about for quite some time. I was just shocked by her rivalry with Coco Chanel. I had no idea that they had this fiery rivalry, but I think it's very interesting what time dictates as important and not important. I think it's just fascinating, you know, the results of someone's opinion 30 years later. So leave a comment down below. Make sure you like and subscribe. Every time you engage with my video, you leave a like, you leave a comment, you leave multiple comments. That always stimulates my video and that really, really helps me out. So please go ahead and do so. Also, feel free to leave a comment who you want to see coming up next. I have a long list and I am slowly going through it because I'm only one person, but you can feel free to leave a comment down below letting me know what requests you want to see in the near future. And I think this is all I have for you guys for today. So thank you all so much for stopping by. Hope you have a beautiful day and I'll see you next time. Bye.